首先，我想为各位介绍一下我们今天的 keynote speaker，也是 Julie。那 Julie 呢，她是一位 DDD 大师级的讲师，她是一位 DDD 大师级的讲师。那她不但有数十年的软体开发经验，也是位非常资深的软体教练与顾问。除了帮助团队重新思考与设计软体的架构，导入现代化的开发实务外，也协助团队如何使用 DDD 去建模、去开发程式。他有非常多傲人的头衔，不但是 Dr. Captain Pluralsight 的讲师、社群发起人、专业讲师，也有多年的打内教育经验 ，MVP 也是 Microsoft 的 Regional Director。有这么多傲人的经历，但是他本身却常常在第一线，在社群的第一线，为大家介绍引进各种先进的技术啊，帮助团队更有效率的去前进开发他们想要心目中的软体。好，那么接下来请我们议程组的志工为我们播放接下来的演讲。好 ，So without further ado, let's get started.
Good morning. I am so happy to be here and so honored to be keynoting the DDD Taiwan conference this year, especially with the theme being footprints of pioneers. Now, I may not be a pioneer, but I love the idea of footprints and everybody's learning journey for domain-driven design. My name is Julie Lerman, and I must admit, not only am I not in Taiwan with all of you right now, which I wish I were, but I've also am providing you a recorded talk. I'm recording this talk for you in advance just so that we don't have any issues with internet since I'm so far away. Where I am is in Vermont in the US. However, I am online with you all today and will be available in the really, really fun community area. So I am here, but at the moment, as I'm speaking, I'm not. So I am definitely somebody who's very passionate about domain-driven design, but I have spent a lot of time thinking and talking and worrying about how to make domain-driven design more accessible to people. It's a really, really big topic, and that's what I'll be talking about today. So the title of this talk is Getting to Domain-Driven Design, Pragmatic or Principled. And this will hopefully be helpful to you, whether you're on your own journey into learning domain-driven design, or if you are somebody who's already interested and excited about it and really looking for ways to help others learn about domain-driven design. And I do want to give a little background about the first reason that I created this talk. I was at Domain-Driven Design Europe, and I do know that a lot of you are .NET developers, so you might know me also from my involvement with Entity Framework. And I was doing a workshop on Entity Framework at the DDD conference. And after my workshop and some feedback from a few people, I wrote this tweet about Entity Framework Core and domain-driven design and used the word purists in the tweet. And I got in a little bit of trouble. Not trouble, it just, a few people were a little annoyed by my use of that term. So, perhaps purists was one word, or I could have also used the word principled instead of purists. But, the reason I wrote that tweet and the reason I am giving this talk to you today is to really look at if we could be more pragmatic about how we approach domain-driven design and learning domain-driven design, but still retain the principles and the important guidelines and guidance that domain-driven design gives us. And I use those words guidelines and guidance very intentionally. I think a lot of people look for rules and definitions. And when we have rules and definitions, that definitely shuts out a lot of people because they're worried if I'm not following the rules exactly. So I want people to be able to use DDD well and benefit from it, but not worry about having to be an expert from end to end of domain-driven design before you begin trying to leverage it in the way you approach building your software. I have been with clients. I even spent a week at a client at a very large company with a few teams that had gotten to the point where they did not want to hear anything about domain-driven design anymore. And that was because of the way it had been presented to them by other members of their teams. And these are more of the people who, the people who were sharing it with them were of the mind that you need to know everything all at once before you can start. And they just did not want to hear about it anymore. So I'm really familiar with this problem. And I would like to say, after the week that I spent there kind of backing up and giving them a new approach and a new entrance ramp to domain-driven design, that they felt so much better about it. And I left there with them being really eager to continue their DDD learning. So I want to play a game. I want you to play a game. And granted, this is something I usually do with a live audience when I'm standing up on stage and you're all together in a room. And I thought long and hard about how to recreate this when we're virtual. So this is what we'll do. Normally, what I would have you do is face the person next to you and play a mirror game where one person is drawing, let's see, like if I can do this if my hand's in the camera, if I'm drawing the number 2, right, as I'm drawing it and it looks right to me, it's totally backwards to you. So I will be your partner, and I just want you to try this. You don't have to touch the screen, but just do it in the air. Follow along with me, and I kind of have to look over to make sure I've got this right, so I'm not going to be looking right at you. So try to follow me as I draw the number 2. So your finger following my finger, right? So it's like you're in a mirror. So there's the number 2. Now we'll try the number 4. So here's 4. Right, and I'm writing it, so it's perfectly fine for me. And then I'm going to draw the number 6, so go ahead and follow me. Oops, I went off the camera there, sorry. Now I'll do an 8. I'll start up a little higher to get a little over to the left. Okay, so now I'm going to draw the number 8. Let's do that again. I don't know if I did it right because I was trying to make sure. Okay, there's 8. And now one more, we'll do 10. Okay, so 10. Let me go. 1 and 0. So how did it go? Was it a little harder than you expected it to be because everything was backwards? But, of all of those, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10, what do you think for you, what was the easiest thing to draw? Now, when I've been in rooms of people and ask, sometimes I hear 4, sometimes I hear 8, but most often the answer, which makes most sense to me, is 10. And the reason is because you're not really doing anything backwards when you're drawing a 1. If you're drawing it just a simple straight line 1, right? That's really easy. And, drawing a circle, whichever way you draw it is pretty easy. And so I think of this game, and I do want to shout out to my friend Jessie Sternhus, who I saw her do this at another conference where she was talking about using improvisation to help developers unlearn some bad habits. So I adapted it for this. So this isn't about unlearning, it's about learning. And so, if you think about having to try to write all those numbers backwards, like all at once, and it might have been a little confusing and a little overwhelming, but perhaps you had a little relief when you got to draw the 1 and the 0. Right. And this, to me, is an interesting expression of how I think it's more helpful for people to learn new concepts, especially something as big as domain-driven design. So what if I had started by just asking you to do a mirror of the number 1, right? That's pretty easy and pretty easy to be successful at, and maybe even 1 and 0, or maybe we should account and we could start with 0 and do the 1, right? Once you've done those, like, oh, okay, now I know how to do those. And maybe you've got confidence to continue on to do a 2 and a 4 and a 6 and an 8. And this is really, for me, the idea of learning one thing at a time, one thing where A, you're getting confidence from it, and B, it's actually something that can be useful without having to know the whole thing, is how I approach sharing domain-driven design with other people. and how, if you're new to DDD, I hope you'll be happy with learning that way. And if you're somebody who's been doing domain-driven design for a while, think about this as you're sharing your love of domain-driven design with other people. So for me, starting with just pieces of domain-driven design, right? The core principles of domain-driven design, instead of saying, you need to read Eric Evans' DDD book from page 1 all the way to the end before we can begin on a project. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have an understanding of the whole concept of domain-driven design. That's really important. But to really have pieces of it that you're using and implementing, it's hard to learn all of them at once. But you can still benefit by learning and understanding a piece of it and applying that and implementing that. And then you can start growing your understanding and your use of the practices and patterns that we learned from domain-driven design. As opposed to saying, hey, here is the mind map of domain-driven design, and this is what we're going to learn, right? Like, I would turn around and run out of the room like, oh my gosh, it's too much. And I have to say, after going through the process, my little, gaining more knowledge and more knowledge, I have a pretty good understanding of this mind map. But at the beginning, when I first started learning about domain-driven design, there was no way. It was overwhelming and it was confusing. So, or as opposed to having a picture of the mind map, if somebody, came into the room and said, okay, roll up your sleeves, we're going to do domain-driven design, right? Or if, you've never heard of DDD before, done any of the practices, okay, we're going to use an aggregate root, and we're going to use value objects, and we're going to use this, and we're going to use that. And it's just like, it's so many terms and so many concepts and new things to understand. So one of the things that I do a lot when I'm working with clients who are learning about domain-driven design, instead of talking to them about aggregate roots, like, at the beginning, aggregate roots and value objects and aggregates and bounded context and ubiquitous language and all of these things, which, I understand this is the very first talk you're hearing at this conference. So you'll be hearing a lot about these things throughout the next couple of days in the sessions and the workshops. But what I do is, instead of saying, okay, now we're going to start using aggregate roots, I don't tell them the term. I show them, right? I show them some code, or maybe not even code. We don't really start with the idea of the code. We start with the idea of the business problem that we're trying to solve. So I kind of map some of that stuff out, and we can talk about it, and they understand it. And then I let them know, by the way, and I should say, I don't happen to start with this particular example, but whichever concept from domain-driven design it is, I'll start by showing it to them. And once they have an understanding of it, then I tell them, okay, in domain-driven design, this has a particular name. And it's important to understand those names, that terminology, so that you can have conversations with other people about what you're doing. And that parallels really interestingly to one of the concepts of domain-driven design. It's referred to as ubiquitous language. Don't worry too much about what that is. You'll learn more about it later. And that term ubiquitous, so it just means a language that's used everywhere. And domain-driven design itself, in its terminology, has its own language. So it is important. In domain-driven design, we use that ubiquitous language so that we can communicate with each other about the domain, about the problems that we're solving. So as we step back as practitioners and we need to talk about what it is that we're doing in terms of the architecture or the modeling, it is important to use and understand those terms so that we can all be on the same page and have clarification on it. I have been fortunate to be at a number of conferences where Michael Feathers has spoken. And at one of them, he was talking about inside-out architecture. And I thought about that with respect to how I share domain-driven design with people, and it seemed to resonate, right? Instead of starting, it's the same idea. Instead of starting with the language and with the terminologies and then showing what structure that represents, I go the other way around, right? I show the structure and then I introduce the language. So for me, that's how I see it, as being inside out. And also, I know a lot of people like to use the gardening analogy, but it works really well, and it works for me. I like to garden, but I'm not a master gardener. This is about where I am at these days. Although even painting all those tires so beautifully might be above my pay grade, as they say. But this is how you can start, right? So this may not be master gardener level wonderful garden, right? But it's still a thing of beauty, and it's achieving a lot by creating beauty, even though it's not, amazing gardening. Like maybe all those plants are in their own little pots. You buy them in a pot and you just stick them in there. I don't know. But there's a beautiful little garden, right? So with a little bit of knowledge about gardening, you can still benefit and you can still achieve something beautiful. And, maybe eventually someday, depending on how much free time you have, you'll get to this kind of a garden, right? But if you, think about that with all of the different things you need to understand and know about domain-driven design, right? You can start with a small amount. And then, if you're on a team, there may be other people who have more knowledge, and you can work together and they can mentor you as you gain more knowledge, but you don't have to have that expertise going in. So one of the most important concepts within all of domain-driven design is the bounded context. And it's interesting that in recent years, and so Eric Evans wrote the book on domain-driven design, and it was published in 2003. So when I say in recent years, maybe within the last 10 years, he has said numerous times that if he were to write the book over again, he would start with a concept of bounded context, because it's really so critical to domain-driven design. But it's also the most potentially misunderstood concept in domain-driven design. And I totally agree, because I also had I had to take a path into it, right? I did not understand it right away. So the really high level explanation of bounded context is when you're looking at your whole domain and the whole big business problem that you're trying to solve, and it's just it's too many things going on all at once. So what we do with the bounded context is we break it down into smaller solvable parts. So aligning that to cells, right? These are cells, and each of these cells is very bounded or constrained by the membranes, these orange membranes that surround them. And those membranes prevent the bounded contexts, or those cells, from communicating directly with each other, from having to know about what's going on in the other cells, right? And having to have all of that complexity added to their own problems, right? And also, leaking information from one to another. So with the cells, like with the bounded context, you can just focus on one small part of the problem and just don't worry about all the rest, because like those membranes, domain-driven design gives us wonderful ways that people have a lot of experience with of communicating between those cells, taking information from one cell and sharing it with another cell. So those patterns all exist. So you can actually say, let me just focus on this one problem, right? I'm not going to worry about those other problems. And suddenly life does become simpler. I promise you. I even apply the idea of these boundaries. After dinner, and there's dishes and food to put away, and this problem going on and that, and I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to focus on one. And okay, I can handle washing the dishes, right? Put them in the dry rack, right? Okay, now I'll go, well, maybe I should put the food away first. Okay, so I'll take that problem first, right? But there's so much value to this concept of just breaking a big problem that is maybe overwhelming down into small problems. And then each of the small problems you can solve right? And much less stressful. And then worry about the interactions of them because we have all those patterns. So you don't have to worry about that. So I've kind of driven towards this in this explanation. My path to domain-driven design, before I truly understood bounded context, I definitely grasped the idea of boundaries and benefited from boundaries greatly before I was knowledgeable enough to really understand bounded context and implement bounded context and all that evolves around that. I'll take myself as an example. So I know a lot of you are .NET developers, and so you know about Entity Framework. In the early days of Entity Framework, the way it worked was that you pointed it to a database. The database might have, the legacy database might have 700 tables and 25,000 relationships, and you point it there and create one big huge model from that. And I would just look at that and say, this just can't be right. It's so complex, right? So with the idea of boundaries, that one of the early things I understood from domain-driven design, I was able to look at these entity domain models and say, whoa, wait a minute, I don't need to look at all of it at once. Let me just create a small model that's just, these things, because these things all relate to each other and they're transactional. And I can just focus on that. And then, slowly I'm pulling apart this huge model and I have a lot more things I'm dealing with, but each of those things is so much simpler that it's overall a huge benefit to have broken it down. And I do like to think of myself as a canary in the coal mine. I don't know if you know this analogy. In coal mines, the air isn't very good down there. And the poor little canaries, they would take these little canaries down into the coal mine. And if the canary could still breathe, then it was, a good chance that the coal miner would be safe. But if the canary died, sorry, then they knew it was terrible, really. Anyway, now I'm really sad about the canary, so we'll just go to haha. So I feel like that with a lot of technology, right? I feel like if I can learn it, you can learn it, right? Entity Framework, I figured it out. Here, I'll show you how to use it. And I had my path to domain-driven design. It was not the same as, it wasn't, I read the whole book and then I was like, oh, okay, I understand it all. Now I'm going to do it. It was little by little by little. So I actually want to share with you what that path was. So I understood the concept of domain, right? Like the business problem you're working on, or maybe part of that business problem that you're trying to solve. So I understood that I was focused on. And then I understood the concept of boundaries, right? And interestingly, domain-driven design, when you read different books or courses, et cetera, they don't really focus on boundaries. They go right into bounded context. And, so I looked at bounded context, but I didn't really get all of it, but I understood that concept of boundaries. And you'll see it wasn't an immediate next step to bounded context. From there, I started really understanding this idea of each of the bounded contexts, even though to me it was just something with a boundary, should use separate databases. And that, that also sounds like, oh, that's crazy. Why would you do that? But, we hear a lot more about that with microservices as well. And, the capability, I think, coming from somebody who's been programming for 30 years, the idea of, multiple databases, SQL Server, and thinking how expensive it is and everything, like things are very, very different now. But understanding why, like not trying to share everything all in one place, how much simpler things get, and these problems just start sorting themselves out by, this deep separation of concerns by saying, we're going to have this data stored here and this data stored here, and not try to make it related, and not try to normalize it, and not try to share it for, have data that has lots of different meanings, right? So within these boundaries, things have specific meanings, and with those meanings, will store them in their own database. And again, trusting that, our technology provides, not only our technology, but ideas from domain-driven design give us all kinds of ways to share that data. So that didn't seem to, I finally realized, it took a while to realize it wasn't as big a deal as I originally thought. Then, and again, I'm not here to teach you all of these different things because you've got 2 full days of sessions and workshops, but you'll hear these things. So the next thing that I really understood in domain-driven design, I started really understanding the idea of the aggregate root. So like the in a graph of objects, the objects that's responsible for all the business logic and the rules of that transactional unit. From there, I finally started understanding value objects. And this is where I always have to stop and say value objects were the hardest thing for me to get my head around. The further away I get from that, the harder it might be for me to understand how hard it was. But I will never forget how hard it was. And that I learned, I think it was like 5 completely different examples from books, from conference talks, from conversations that I had with different people or from different people. Completely different perspective on describing what a value object was, right? And, I got the first one and I didn't quite get it. And the second one, I didn't quite get it. It wasn't until that 5th one. And I'll tell you, I remember Microsoft's Tech Ed conferences. I was at a Tech Ed conference. I was speaking, but Jimmy Nielsen was also speaking. And he gave an example of value objects that had something to do with eggs and an egg carton. And I can't remember exactly what it was. I should go back and find video of that. But there was something about his explanation. Now, it wasn't his explanation that was, oh, finally, the perfect explanation. But I had the ability to take what he was saying and put it together with all the other descriptions that I've heard. And then putting them all together, I finally went, oh, I get it. Okay, I get it, right? So the reason I'm telling you that is here I am giving a keynote talk at a DDD conference, right? I want you to understand it doesn't just come to me like that. It's just because I'm here giving a conference talk and a keynote doesn't mean that, oh, I'm one of those people where everything's really easy. I'm persistent. So, I kept at it. And, it's just, I just want you to know that. So, if you don't get it right away, don't stress out about it. Don't beat yourself up about it, right? It's normal. And it's just a matter of hearing an explanation that is designed in the same pattern that your brain works, right? And that was me. I had to take all these others together. Now, when I teach domain-driven design, especially, the beginning, getting started, I have a Pluralsight course on it that I did with my friend Steve Smith. I try to take the way that now I understand it to try to see if that is a more helpful way for people to first understand it. Anyway, so value objects, I just, like any of the other pieces here, don't stress out. By the time I heard that 5th explanation, I already had all this other stuff kind of under my belt. Like I got it. And understanding those things helped me finally get to my aggregate root. Now, I've mentioned this before, ubiquitous language. This was something that I think I had a hard time with it, mostly because I saw the term too many times before I understood it. And and I started getting like those developers at that client, like, I don't want to hear about ubiquitous language anymore. I don't understand it. And you just keep saying that word. What is the Princess Bride? You keep saying that word, but I don't think you really know what it means. Well, the people who were saying it did know what it means. It's just, you keep saying it and I don't understand. Now I understand, right? And again, it was just part of my path. Putting together all of these things, bounded context finally gelled. And bounded context is actually very tightly tied to ubiquitous language. Interesting. And it's important to have that language so that when you're talking about a particular problem, or problem set, everybody's on the same page and you all know what you're talking about because, we're in the context of selling boots, right? So, when we talk about heal, right, these are things in our business, right? That's something within our business. Or we talk about, certain aspects of manufacturing boots. We know that those specific to manufacturing boots, some of those words, the things that you do when you're manufacturing boots, you might have the same word when you're manufacturing computers, but it means something totally different because it's a whole different set of problems. And the reason I'm harping on this a little bit right now is because I learned that there's a lot of people who, when they first learned about ubiquitous language, they thought it meant throughout the entire domain, across every single bounded context. So I just want to leave you with that, right? It's per bounded context. So all of these things helped me understand better and better a bounded context. And then anti-corruption layers are just one of the patterns that we have for communicating data that needs to go maybe from one bounded context to another, or messages or events that need to go. And I have that one in there specifically because, again, I had this kind of brain freeze on anti-corruption layers. Interestingly, not on what they were for, but the actual name. I would stop and go, ACL, right? I would remember ACL and then I would say ACL, anti-corruption layers, whenever I'm trying to talk about them. So all of these things, little by little over time, with the support of other people that I'm working with, enabled me to finally grasp that full mind map of domain-driven design, right? But along the way, understanding boundaries before I understood bounded context already benefited me a great deal, and throughout. So I wanted to talk a little bit about when I go in to work with a client, and usually they're refactoring, they're dealing with some legacy code. And I just wanted to give you an idea of what it is that I'm doing and how I approach that. So for you, what this could mean is, if you're on a team and you're dealing with legacy software and, bringing the ideas and the guidance from domain-driven design into the mix. So usually these clients are dealing with legacy software. And what this might mean for you is, if you're in that situation and you're trying to help your team or help others use domain-driven design ideas to begin looking at the software and how you might start refactoring it. This is sometimes my approach. So one of the things I'll do is work on, and look for these ideas as you go through the next couple of days. I'll work on a transactional bundle of objects that go together. For example, if you're doing sales, an order with its line items, right? And an order, we have certain rules about that order. So what we do is we'll look at just that, right? That group of objects that travel through your application together, and look to see if we can find boundaries, right? For example, you might say, well, it's a customer with an order with line items and products, right? And now we've got all the problems of maintaining the customer suddenly involved in this problem. And, so I start looking for boundaries and exploring that. And we just do this on a whiteboard. And you might keep turning it on its head, right? Just different perspectives. But I don't talk about aggregate roots, right? I don't talk about value objects and, bounded context. I just say, let's look at, your domain and let's look at the problems you're trying to solve. And, let's just try to get some new perspective on them. Along the way, then I'll say, oh, by the way, we refer, when we're talking using domain-driven design ideas, we refer to this as an aggregate root, or we refer to this as an aggregate, or we refer to this as a value object or an entity or whatever. Then, and then we just dig in and do a little more work, go a little more deeply, right? And again, just whiteboarding without terms, right? And then say, oh, by the way, the thing that we just did, this is, in DDD, it's called this and this and that. So I slowly introduce the terms as they get more accustomed to the concepts. So we just go back and forth like that. And eventually, their garden, so this is more my style garden, a little more of like, I think it's called an English garden, a little more wild. But, and it grows. Your understanding of domain-driven design grows, and your ability to apply these ideas to the software you're building and gain the benefits that domain-driven design gives us, which, in my mind is to make my life simpler, right? To de-stress. The subtitle of Eric Evans' book is Tackling Complexity, right? Tackling complexity. So we take this, like, this might look complex, right? But it started from something small. And, another thing I want to point out, it's not that it's a criticism of this idea of learning domain-driven design little by little. And I've heard other like DDD gurus talk about, is this approach, is it really domain-driven design, or is it something like domain-driven design light? But when they say that, right, I think, well, that sounds kind of negative, like it's just a lightweight version. Maybe they even say LITE, which, LIGHT, that's a wonderful thing, right? It's shining light on things. But what they're saying is, like a lightweight version of DDD, right? Which is not a terrible thing, right, in a lot of people's minds. But I prefer to think of it as DDD core, right? The core elements of domain-driven design, like, really, like, learn that bounded context, learn how to identify boundaries, then, and then dig in deeper. So I do prefer referring to it as DDD core. And then a few last things that I want to leave you with that, I think is really important to share when you're talking about domain-driven design. First of all, again, as you'll learn throughout the next couple of days, DDD is really made up of two really important areas. One is strategic design, where you do all this planning, right, where you figure out where those boundaries lie, and then figure out how things relate to each other within those boundaries, and then figure out, how you're going to enable communication of messages or data between those boundaries. So within strategic design, one of the most important things is about client collaboration, which doesn't end with strategic design. And focusing on, when you are looking at the big problem of your domain and you divide it up into smaller problem sets, really, identifying what is the most important piece that drives your business, right? What's unique about your business that really makes money, right? That like, what is the most important thing, and really focusing on that. And then for me, reducing the complexity, which also reduces stress, discovering those bounded contexts and boundaries, and discovering that ubiquitous language within those bounded contexts. Then the other big piece of it is, once you've done all that strategizing, it's really time to start thinking about how you're going to put the code together, right? How you're going to implement these domains, these bounded contexts that you've defined during the strategic design. And, it can really lead you to writing better code. Value objects really are a beautiful thing. And, the same client that I went to, where everybody was saying, I don't want to hear any more about domain-driven design. The end of the last day, one of the developers, and this is a very, very intelligent guy, came up to me and said, I never really thought about value objects before, and now I realize how beautiful they are and how important they are. And now I'm so excited about learning more about what DDD gives me, right? Enables me to build better software. Like, I almost, some people would be like, mic drop me. I was like almost crying when he said that. And, there are really interesting things to learn about how we define relationships between our entities in domain-driven design. Aggregate root is, all of these things, as I learn them and as I see other people learning them, the aggregate roots, and this importance, one of the things that DDD really helps is to eliminate like side effects, like unexpected, unanticipated side effects, right? Because you don't have things that are just connected all over the place, right? Things are really bound, right? So these are the things that you define as your, or these are the benefits that we gain as we're working inside the bounded context and doing the implementation, the tactical design. So things that you can look forward to as you're learning more about domain-driven design. So I hope this, talking about these things will help you as you move through the talks and the workshops of the next couple of days. You're going to be inundated with all kinds of really amazing ideas, and it may feel overwhelming, but don't stress out about them, right? You can just kind of take it all in, and it'll be back there when you're ready for it. But, find the things that really make the most sense to you, and those are where you can start with. So have a wonderful conference, and I look forward to chatting with you in the virtual community room. It looks like so much fun. I've had a little tour of it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks Julie for her excellent speech. And let's give her a round of applause silently in front of your computer. Okay, thanks, Julie. Okay, silently, yeah. Okay, so I love Julie's speech very much, her speech very much, especially when the idea of don't tell, just do, and find some boundaries first, and forget about all those jargons, aggregate roots, parent objects first, and focus on the domain. Okay. The next part will be we'll turn to Slido, and we have 10 more minutes for our Q&A sessions. Let me share my screen. Okay, so if you haven't posted your question on the Slido, you have some minutes to do it, and you can upvote your favorite questions. Okay, so okay. 好，那我们先来看一下第一个问题。So Julie, so the first question is, could you explain more on the difference between subdomain and bounded context? 你可以解释一下 subdomain 跟 bounded context 之间的差异吗 ？Please.
Yeah, that's actually a great question because sometimes when you identify the subdomain, that has the same boundaries as the bounded context. So quite often they look like just the same piece of your domain, but there are times, and that's probably the most normal, where once you've identified the subdomain, and then, so I'm just going to back up a little bit. So the subdomains are what you look for first. You don't start by looking for bounded context. You look to identify the different subdomains. And then you start talking about the subdomains. This is when the ubiquitous language starts evolving. And it's from that ubiquitous language that you start defining the bounded context. So quite often, the perimeter, right, that which is the subdomain aligns perfectly with a bounded context. But sometimes you might find that you need to implement that subdomain as two different bounded contexts for one reason or another. And interestingly, I've got a Pluralsight course called Domain-Driven Design Fundamentals that I did with Steve Smith. And when we first did the course, we interviewed on video, on camera, we interviewed Eric Evans. And this was one of the questions we asked him. And he also, his answer was more deeper than what I've just said. But if you do happen to watch that course, you can also see Eric with the way that he helps explain how sometimes it's the same and sometimes it's different. So a little hard to deeply answer that right now, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Oh, that's a well explanation. If you have more interested, please check the videos with the interview with Eric Evans.
Yeah, and Pluralsight is free this week through the 7th. It's been all week, and through Sunday, the 17th, it's free. So if you don't even have a Pluralsight subscription, you can still go watch it.
Whoa, that's a big surprise. Thanks for sharing that. 好，下一题是我们公司有一个巨大的大泥球系统，维护了20年，我们可以怎么去替换它吗？ Our company has a big ball of mark system with a history of more than 20 years. How can we replace that system through DDD in stages interactively, please?
This is a very common conversation, a very common question, because most often people are dealing with legacy applications, right? Not everybody gets to start with a brand new idea and build it up from scratch. And you know, nobody can just say, okay, we're just going to replace the whole thing all at once, right? It's hard. It's like impossible to do. There are actually quite a few patterns for doing that. And people talk about that a lot when they talk about microservices, when they talk about evolving their system into microservices. But, you know, you need a plan. There's no question about that. And absolutely, it's something that, you know, you would need to do iteratively. But first, you know, you need to just kind of step back. I think the most important first step is to look at the business almost like it's brand new, like try to understand it from a very new perspective, because the one thing you don't want to do is just rewrite the same logic that was how you thought about it 20 years ago, and then just write it, you know, in new code, right? It's the best opportunity to really step back and reconsider how data would, you know, how the data is moving around, how, you know, what the problems are, what are the most important problems to focus on. One other thing I want to say about that is when I'm helping people learn these techniques, what we do is we look for that low-hanging fruit, if you know that phrase, like kind of the easiest thing, but that's not for the implementation. That's just for learning. Like we do the easy thing because it's something easy to learn with. But doing that strategic design can also help you identify what your path is through the changes. What's the most, you know, what is the most effective thing you can create the most quickly, or you know, as you're learning. So that's a huge question. So hopefully that's a little bit of an idea of where to begin.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. That's very useful. 所以基本上，如果我们要处理这种 legacy system， 可能要先退一步，先把你们的整个系统的业务先了解后，而不是先跳进去重写。Okay, the next question. 你是否有经验在非 server 的地方，比如说 mobile 或是桌面应用程式使用 DDD 的经验呢？ Do you have an experience to work with a group of people that is not applying DDD on server side, like mobile or desktop? Can you share something about that?
Sure. Personally, I haven't been involved in that. However, I've had a lot of conversations with people who have been doing it. There are even a few people who, speakers and people who are writing and training that focus on, and it's kind of unusual, focus on domain-driven design for the front end, which is really interesting, you know, applying the ideas. But one of the most interesting stories that was shared with me was with somebody who, again, they had a legacy app, and the back end of that app worked perfectly, and they didn't want to muck with it, but they needed to have a modern front end. They needed to modernize the front end for their users because it was just so old-fashioned, and they wanted something new. So what they ended up doing was, because they wanted to leave like their old DB2 database intact and their old COBOL code intact, they found a COBOL developer to write an API in front of the COBOL logic. And so their new user interface just talked to the API, and then the API just let the COBOL logic do everything that it's always been able to do. And they did something similar in front of the database. They put an ORM, not entity, I don't think it was entity framework, but an ORM in front of DB2 that allowed them to query out of the database without having to know how to interact with DB2. And they were then able to apply and use really modern, not just modern tools, but modern software practices with the new stuff. So it was really, really interesting. And I really think of that as domain-driven design thinking to have come up with that solution.
Okay, thanks. That's very insightful and knowledgeable. Okay, so it's 9:50 here. So our first speech ends here, and let's give Julie a very big thanks. Okay, thanks, Julie. Nice to meet you. Hope we can see you next year or in a few years.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. It really was a pleasure.
Yeah, we are also honored to have you here. So thank you. Bye-bye.